Hello and welcome to the lecture on constants. So let's look at the material folder, variable and constants, and example 16 constants. Let's look at what we will learn in this lecture. Okay, so part of this we will understand how to define and use constant. Then we'll try to change the value of a constant and see if you change a value of a constant what will happen. We'll use the same name as variable and constants to see whether it's able to differentiate between variable name and a constant name with the same name. Then we'll understand some of the naming rules of constants. Then we'll use the method isSet method, which we use for variables. And part of this we will create all these files. Okay, so first, what is constant? Constant is basically a value which doesn't change across your program. If you want to define a value that's basically holding up some string or integer and you don't want to change that value in your overall program, then you define a constant, whereas variable will change the values. Constant doesn't change the value. That's all this difference is. So part of this, if you go to www folder, so we have done with variables, so let's go ahead and create a folder called constants. Okay, so let's open our Sublime, then let's start creating our first program. Control N, Control S, and I'm going to change the folder to constants. Okay, let me open my browser. Okay, the browser is here. Okay, so let's define a constant. So I'll say define constant, and this is going to be our sample one. To define a constant, you need a function that is called as define. Define has two parameters. The first one is basically the name of the constant, and next one is the value of the constant. Right, that's how you basically define a constant. So let's define one constant. And the good practice is basically whenever you define a constant, make it uppercase. Okay, so let's define a constant called language and give a value of PHP. Okay, now let's see how to print this. Okay, before printing we can even do this. Okay, how do you assign a constant to a variable? So you just, how do you assign a constant to a variable? So you'll say language, and if you look at it here, we are not using any dollar sign here. Okay, if you use a dollar sign, it becomes a variable. Whatever value that you give here mostly should be uppercase, just to define it's a constant. That value you can directly use as a normal English, right? There's no special characters in front to make it understand it's a constant. Okay, so let's try to print this. So let's say echo I'm going to increase this length so that you can see the program. This program is written using, then I'll call the variable first. Okay, let's call the variable first so that we know how to differentiate between variables and constants. So I'm going to copy this. This time let me call language here, and then what I'll say, okay, so I want to call it outside. So now the question here is whether it's a string or it's a constant. How does the PHP understand this? Because you're not assigning any dollar value here, and without a dollar value, is it considered as a string, like a normal string, or is it considered as a language, which is nothing but a constant? And here it's very straightforward because it's outside the string interpolation. So here it should be able to understand it's a constant. Let's print this and let's understand how this works. Constants, let's open our file name. Okay, and if you see here, the first one was a variable. The second one, it was not able to identify it's a constant, so it treated this one as a string. So remember that There's no string interpolation for constant, right? Don't do that. If you have to define or print a constant, you have to do it outside your strings. Okay, for the first one, it's good to see the first one was able to interpolate, right? It was able to convert or change the value of the lang to the actual value of the lang. But in the second line, the same double quotes is unable to recognize a constant. So you have to remember this. Someone will ask you this: if you define this and you print this, whether the language is going to print PHP or the string is going to print a string. So every time you define it outside your strings. Okay, so that was the first example, and let's do a second example where we'll try to change the value of a constant. So copy this, copy the file name, Control N, Control S, and paste it here. Right, so I'll call it sample2. So let's redefine, means change the value of a constant. I'm gonna say same language. This time I'm gonna say Java. Right, I'm trying to change a constant, and if you have worked with constants before, you should not be changing a value of a constant, right? So let's look at what happens if you change a value of a constant. So let's print this, and we'll use the same echo here. And can you make a guess what will happen? Is it gonna print PHP or is it gonna print Java? Make a guess. So in the meantime, I'll execute this. Okay, it's gonna print PHP. It doesn't care how many times you will change it after it is defined. It still holds the value of the first definition, right? You try to change the value, it still holds PHP. That's basically the constant. Constant doesn't change value. That's why it's called as constant. Okay, so let's look at the third example. The third example is same name with variable and constant. So let's look at this. Sample3. This time I'll say language as a variable, right? And let's see what happens if I do this. And I'll try to do print the constant and print the variable and the constant. So is it going to be differentiating, or it will error out saying that, oh, language constant is already defined, now you cannot define a variable? Okay, so let's verify that. Is it gonna check that, or is it gonna ignore that? Well, it's gonna ignore that. It doesn't really care what name you give to the constant and what name you give to the variable. Even though the names are same, it doesn't really matter. It's able to differentiate that. Okay, so let's look at the fourth example. We'll look at one of the naming rules. And most of the naming rules will tie back to what we have seen in the variables. It's all going to be same. Let's look at one of the constant naming convention. So let me define, we know the variable should not start with an integer. So let's define one, say version, right? And we say 7.3. Then we say echo one version. Okay, so let's execute this. This is number 4, and it's an error. It's an error because you cannot have constant name starting with an integer. Okay, if you remove this, it should work fine. Okay, so I'm going to leave the sample here. I'm going to comment this out. The last one will use the eset method to see whether the value is set for constant or not. Okay, so I'm going to copy this. So we're going to look sample 5, and I'm going to define a name, and this time I will not assign any value to it. just to check whether the eset method works or not for constant. So I'll say echo eset of name, and I'll say echo name. So let's execute this program and see whether you can use eset for constant. Okay, if you execute 5, no, you cannot use eset for a constant. So remember this, if you want to verify a constant is empty, you cannot use eset. Okay, the last one I want to add it here is how to access constant using the constant method. There's a method called constant, and we can say constant, and we can say name. So I want to call this name. Okay, let's comment this out. Obviously you can say echo, right? If we haven't set any name, we can use language and print it. And here's your language. All right, so let's do a quick review. So for sample 1, we understood how to define a constant. We assign it to a variable, and remember that you cannot print a constant inside the double quotes, it has to be outside. You can have same name, then you cannot, second sample we saw you cannot change a constant is unchangeable. When you try to change it, it doesn't error out, but it doesn't change the value. The sample 3, we created the same variable name as a constant, and it doesn't really care whether you have the same name or not. Then fourth, we saw the naming convention. Sample 5, we saw whether we can use eset method to check whether a name constant is empty or not. Then we try to use a method called constant to access a constant. Okay, well, that's all for this constant lecture, and I'll see you in the next one.